Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Sorry for the delay. I was having some technical difficulties here, but it looks like I've got it worked out now. Since I was having some difficulties there, let me get back up to speed, and we will be able to start. Okay, I think we'll call this meeting here to order, and I'll go through and take a roll call just to make sure I know who all we have here. I'm here. I see Dana Veek is here. Dana, do you want to do a quick introduction?
Yeah, sorry. Hi, I'm Dana Veek. I'm a supervisor in the Training and Standards Bureau, and I've worked for the Training and Standards Bureau since 2005. So welcome.
Thank you, Dana. Jerry Mullen.
Good morning. I'm the compliance officer, and I've been in the position since 2017. Thank you.
Thank you, Jerry. Sheriff Schmidt.
Good morning. Dale Schmidt, Dodge County Sheriff, President of Badger State Sheriffs.
Thank you, Sheriff. Good morning. Sheriff Gill.
Good morning. Sheriff Reg Gill, Lafayette County.
Good morning. Welcome. Sheriff Mike Peterson.
Sheriff Peterson did send me a text message. He's tied up in another meeting right at the moment.
Okay. Thank you for letting me know.
You bet.
Chief Bishop.
Chief Bishop from Kewaskum Police Department. I was asked by WCPA President Dean Smith to sit on this committee.
Thank you. Welcome. Jim Palmer.
Good morning, Jim Palmer with the Wisconsin Professional Police Association.
Welcome, Jim. Thank you for coming.
Thank you.
Captain Hefty.
Morning, Frank Hefty, Academy Commander for the State Patrol.
Morning, Frank. Major Kemke.
Hi, good morning. Kara Kamke, Training Director at the DNR.
Good morning. Chief Jones.
Hi, Leanne Jones. I'm from the Town of Beloit Police Department.
Thank you. Hopefully I get this right. Chief Verkamp. Is that correct?
Pretty close. I'm Chief Joe Veerkamp from the Barron Police Department.
Good morning. Welcome. All right. Looks like we have everybody from the committee except for Sheriff Peterson. So we'll continue. Welcome, everyone. My name is Ron Bentley. I'm the Director of Training and Standards. I've been with Training and Standards since 2019 and was appointed Bureau Director in October. Thank you all for coming. So just do want to do kind of a brief overview. I sent out an email that kind of talked about what the mission for this group is going forward. Just for a little bit of background, back in March 2021, the LESB, on the advice at the time of the staff of the Training and Standards Bureau, made an adjustment to the policy that deals with the time frame for law enforcement officers to gain or regain employment. And Jerry, do you want to give a little bit more background on kind of how that came about and explain kind of what the change was and kind of what it meant?
Sure. I did send out an email about a half hour before the meeting with the document. I hope everybody was able to, I apologize for the late notice, but to kind of review that. If not, it's included in that document, but essentially the two primary reasons to make that recommendation for the change was number one, to ensure that we had consistent policy with our eligibility requirements for reciprocity. So for example, in order to be eligible for out-of-state reciprocity for law enforcement certification, a police officer must have a minimum of 1 year of full-time employment within the last 3 years, which was not the case in Wisconsin. And then the other issue was that Wisconsin does not have a definition of part-time employment like other states do, and that's in that document as well. It's essentially anything less than 2,080 hours a year. We're just simply relying on the classification that the agency puts in a CADIS when they hire someone. And there's quite a variation in part-time employment. Someone who's part-time may be working, an average of 20 hours a week, for example, or may be working multiple part-time jobs, where there's others who perhaps might work once a year at like EAA or State Fair Police, for example. So those were kind of the primary reasons to make the recommendations at that time.
Jerry, I don't believe I got that email. I don't know if anybody else did, if you could try at least resend it.
I think I sent it out to staff several weeks ago, but I can resend it to you, Ron.
Okay.
No problem. Yeah.
Okay. So that's a little bit of the mission going forward, just to kind of take a look at what the policy currently is. See if the group wants to recommend to the Law Enforcement Standards Board if it should remain, or if it should remain, there should be some clarification. Or if not, what should the policy be? And then I'd like to look at that definition of part-time versus full-time. And then if not defining part-time, full-time, maybe taking a look at making some type of recommendation when waivers were to come across the LESB's desk, maybe some criteria or guidelines to go by as far as when an officer that's looking for an extension or a waiver, some of the guidelines that we would look at to recommend either approving or denying. As far as training and standards goes, I think myself, Dana, and Jerry will be here kind of as a resource and to help guide the meeting and kind of let the members of the group facilitate the discussion and guide where this goes. So, because we've been involved from the beginning, so we want to get the input from you all, and without, I guess, interjecting too much of where we're at or what our opinions are. So I guess I'll turn it over and see if there's anybody that wants to start a discussion anyplace. I guess we can start probably with what the current policy is and have a roundtable discussion on some thoughts.
If I could jump in here quick, Ron. Just
Yeah,
so everybody has a little bit of a background as to really why we're here. There was a media story done recently that I think it was unfortunate the way that it came out. And it doesn't have all of the facts presented related to the incident at hand. And I appreciate, Ron, you probably not wanting to delve into that, but I think it's important for this committee to have an understanding of kind of what happened. And so there was an individual that raised some concerns with a local media organization, well, not local, statewide media organization, and He's a political pundit that likes to kind of raise some red flags, and I'm not necessarily always opposed to that, but I think he had his facts wrong in this one instance, and I think we want to be careful when we're drafting or reformatting the language in this policy to make sure that we still have. We provide opportunities. I think it's important that we provide opportunities to be able to move from agency to agency when they are part-time. But I think we still also need to make sure that these individuals are qualified. And I think that's the problem here. The individual, I'm not going to go into the specifics here, but the individual that they're referencing worked very little, had very few training hours over a several year period, and certainly did not meet the standards of what we in law enforcement would expect from a part-time law enforcement officer. And to be quite honest, I employ part-timers. I make sure that they're well-trained. Those individuals that are not well-trained, as I think was the intent of training and standards when they implemented this policy, those individuals, if they're not well-trained, put us all at risk for not only the if something goes wrong, the public outcry, but also the potential that some of our coworkers could get hurt because they're not properly trained. So I think it's very important that we have standards set for these part-time officers that are more stringent than what we would do for our full-time cops, because the full-time cops get a lot more training and education than what those part-timers do. And to be honest, a lot of these part-timers are simply doing it to maintain their certification just in case they want to come back someday. So they're putting in maybe a couple hours a month at best. Maybe it's several months before they have any hours. So I think we really, when we're drafting this, it's important that those individuals, like this individual, I don't think he should have been recertified. I think the Training and Standards Board did exactly as they should have in this case. But we need to make sure that we have those standards set, that individuals that don't get the training, that are just doing it to maintain certification, are not maintaining certification, to be quite honest. They need to have a certain number of hours either worked or trained. And I think we have to have that set. I think it's a little too stringent right now. And there are waivers that can be done. Don't get me wrong. I think it's a little too stringent. I think if you have a little bit of a leeway there, I would understand that. But I think we still have to have pretty strict rules. And I'm just, I kind of double booked myself here. I'm gonna have to jump off at 10:30. I don't plan to say a whole lot more than that. I wanted to give the background, and that's my opinion. I'd really like to see the committee put together some good regulation on this, though. Thank you.
Thank you, Sheriff. I see Captain Hefty has his hand raised. Would like to go next?
So I guess the question that I have for this one is, instead of looking at defining part-time, why don't we set the criteria for training the same as we do for full-time officers? So as a full-time officer, I'm required to get my 24 hours of training annually, my 2 hours of handgun. Yet by looking at the policies and looking at other policies, I can go through a 720 recruit class and for 3 years, never do any training, never touch a gun, never do anything, and get a job and go out and work. And I could potentially have to use that gun the first day that I work, but I haven't touched one in 3 years. If you're a part-time officer, you still should be maintaining that 24 hours, the handgun qualification. If you don't get that as a sworn officer in a year, we're decertified. Even if you're a part-time officer, you still should be getting that minimum training. We should be setting that. And after that year, you're no longer eligible. If you look at the CCW, for retirees, after they've retired, they still have to come back and shoot annually to do the state qualification to make sure that they're good with that firearm. But as a law enforcement officer, they don't have that same standard of having to maintain the training for a 3-year time window. And I'm not sure, I recognize that 3 years has been around since I probably started, but I don't know why we arbitrarily have taken that 3 year. And I don't know why we don't require that 24-hour, that same recertification annual requirement for any of the part-time officers to make sure that they're maintaining that. I guess, so that's my concern with this.
Well, my impression or my belief is that part-time officers have to maintain the same certification parameters as a full-time. In other words, they have to have the annual handgun qualification, biennial pursuit curriculum, and attend 24 hours of annual in-service. The recertification is the same for full and part-time. As far as, timeframes to gain or regain employment, the difference comes in, an officer, say, that has been working for an agency part-time, say 8 hours a year for 5 years, and then they separate employment, they're out for 2 years and then want to re-enter. I think if you look back at those 5 years, they had very minimal experience, very minimal, even though they had attended the 24 hours of annual in-service and completed the qualification and pursuit training. They've had very little other training or experience. And then after the separation, wanting to come back, looking at those factors, and then making a decision whether or not we would approve or deny their waiver or their request for to recertify.
And I guess I understand that, Ron, but again, when you're trying to look at uniformity, you have someone that goes on military leave for a year deployment, they get a leave of absence, but when they come back, they have to make up training and they have to do the training, but they haven't worked in law enforcement for a full year. I don't know why we would look at a 3-year window when you could look at a 1-year window and say you've had the training. It could be a leave of absence, but you have to show that you're proficient in those skills. I don't know how you define. I don't know, based on everything that we've had in the past, defining the part-time. I don't know if that makes a difference. I guess that's my question on it. Is I get that there's some people that work 8 hours, or they may work 1 year out of that year, but are they doing any training? How do we legally justify that's different than an excused absence over a year where they didn't get anything? They've been on a military leave or family medical leave or something like that. So I think that's where my questions come in. I understand there's differences in hours, but again, as a full-time law enforcement officer, we've got certain requirements that we have to meet. I think they should have to meet it.
I'm just going to chime in. So I understand what you're saying. So every officer, part-time or full-time, has to do 24 hours of recertification, the handgun vehicles pursuit biennially. The problem is when they leave employment, if you leave a position, we're no longer tracking recertification training. You're not with an agency. So that becomes, how do we track that on our end? When you're with an agency, it's up to the agency administrator to determine what training you receive. Once you're out of that employment, other than handgun and vehicle pursuit, there are no mandatory topics. So we don't, for officers who are out of employment, we no longer track. They get a buy essentially for 3 years. We've kind of taken the view of, well, if you've been working full time and you're going to have more experience than somebody who's, been inconsistent or worked part-time, in a lot of cases, we don't know how much that part-time work is before they go off and are gone from employment for however long they might be gone from employment prior to coming back. The 3-year period it's set forth in administrative code. And I know it's been that way since at least 1993. I don't know where the 3 years comes from either. I've always thought it's kind of an arbitrary number. I don't know, 3 years is sufficient, 5 years is sufficient. That's a hard thing. And every state kind of has a different philosophy on it. And I don't think anybody's ever done a study to say, hey, you're deficient, you're going to be deficient in these abilities to be able to perform these abilities if you're out this period of time without training or without working in the position. I don't think there's anything that says that. So I don't know what's a good period of time, 3, 5, 10, but that's where things stand. I think, we could maybe require that if you leave employment and you hope to get back into law enforcement again in the future, you have to continue to do annual update training and figure out how to make that work. Go to a technical college, go to a local agency who can enter that training in for you to make sure it's being done and that it gets entered into a CADIS so that it can be tracked. But right now we don't have a system for officers who leave an agency. And you're right, if somebody goes on a leave of absence for military or medical reasons, we expect when they return, be it 1 year, 2 years, up to 3 years, that they make up, the training that they missed within 6 months of coming back onto the job. So.
Can I make a comment, please?
Yep.
Yes, go ahead.
I actually read Jerry's email before I logged on. And I definitely like the recommendation to restore the pre-March of 2021. The other thing though too is again is kind of the separation between agency and training and standards. I truly expect that after any leave, we would do a field training period with our officers to make sure that they're in compliance and ready to work in our communities. I know that that's not necessarily in here, but I know we were talking about. I just think it would be a really unfortunate recruitment aspect again. People do get in this job and get out of it at times. And I would like to have an opportunity to have them back in law enforcement without having to attend a 720-hour academy again. Thank you.
If I could just chime in one last time here real quickly, something I forgot to say, and I know Dana touched on it briefly. It's that experience level. Yeah, you've got the difference between part-time and full-time, and they're still required to do that 24 hours, but it's the experience. Those individuals that are out there working 40 hours a week get that ingrained in their mind every single day they're out there, and you can't replace that experience even with training. And when you have a full-time officer giving some leniency for a year or even that 3 years to come back, they've been working it every single day. They have a really good grasp on how things work. When you're working 1 day a month or even 1 day every 2 or 3 months, you don't get that same experience. That's why it's different, is the amount of experience along with that 24 hours. I don't remember most of the 24-hour training I go to be quite honest with you. I remember the experiences that I've actually been out there on the street doing the job. And that's why it's different. And that's why there should be that tighter restriction on those part-time officers. I just forgot to mention that part. And I know that Sheriff Delane, the chair of the LESB, also mentioned that to me. And I thought that was important for the committee to hear.
Ron, if I could jump in as well. Can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead.
Oh, okay. To piggyback along with Sheriff Schmidt, as a very small agency here, we've historically relied heavily on part-time people, both in our jail and patrol and different needs. And I guess originally, as he spoke about the article when that came out, I had a lot of concerns about that. Had a long conversation with Sheriff Delane about that when he kind of explained how that all went and the actual facts of that, and where the changes came from. And I fully understand why it took place the way it did and should have. My concern, I guess, is we specifically have or have had staff that have gone through the academy with no intention whatsoever of ever working full time. Want to help, want to serve, those kind of things, and have given us a great many years of service in a very limited role. Now, I would agree with the chief when it comes down to, if somebody's going to be off for a period of time, any significant length, I think it's the agency's responsibility to make sure that person has been retrained or caught up on the training. All of our part-time people have to maintain the same 24 hours, have to do the firearms, have to do the vehicle driving, all those same requirements as our full-time people. Now, no, they don't have the same experiences during the year, given the number of hours that some work. And we vary anywhere from very few hours all the way up to basically full-time hours. But I guess my only concern is with all the trouble that we're trying to have finding people and filling some of these limited needs, I would hate to see a restriction put on that would prevent that, I guess. And for somebody who kind of in that similar situation as this gentleman that was involved in that article, never really worked a full-time position, but yet was constantly employed as a part-time person. So I guess that was my only concern about it going forward. I did read Jerry's email. I thought I would agree with that recommendation, actually, to at least to some extent. But I think I wouldn't be opposed to some requirement putting back on the agency to make sure that those people who are on some type of an extended leave and want to get back into the business are properly brought up to speed in order to do that. Thank you.
I think if to Sheriff Schmidt's point about the experience is a good one. And that's why a lot of the waivers that I've processed have been for retired law enforcement officers with 20 plus years of experience. And they've been out for 3 years or a little over 3 years, and they, decide maybe to come back and work part-time boat patrol or, as a court security or a transport deputy or just working a few shifts. And those are a little bit easier for me, at least to when I make my recommendations. And I think the board has shown a fair amount of deference to those individuals just because of their levels of experience. Where we run into some more of a gray area is when you have younger officers that have maybe bounced around to a number of different agencies. Maybe they never worked full-time, and that's typically the ones that are denied are those individuals. So it's a little bit of apples to oranges, but the experience part of it, I think, is a valuable. That's a good point, and that's something, like I said, that I certainly take into consideration. I will also ask the officers many times. It's not on the actual waiver form, but hey, what type of work have you been doing in the interim? And if in many cases they might be teaching in an academy, they might be working private investigations or armed security, or even in some other first responder capacity. And that, I think, is a mitigating circumstance when they apply for the waiver, as opposed to maybe if they're driving a truck or working construction, that doesn't really help their cause because it's really completely unrelated to law enforcement type work.
Yeah, I've compiled all of the requests that we've received since this policy went into place. It might be helpful to share that so you can see the types of requests that come in and what our recommendations have been. It's hard to figure out what to do and to provide some consistency. The individual that the article was written on, what you don't know in his situation is that the last year he worked in 2019, he didn't do any recertification training at all, and he was decertified. That's not put in the article. So there's more to the story in that situation. I've got another hearing coming up with an officer who was hired with an agency. He graduated from the academy in 2019. He's hired a couple of months later, part-time with an agency, and doesn't work at all. 2019 till 2021, August 2021, when he resigns, he has no working hours. He's then rehired by the same agency in July of 2023, and he works 111 hours, and he wants to be recertified now. And the board's like, this just doesn't work. So now we've got a hearing to consider this, but those are the types of situations that we're dealing with.
Dana, do you have just a brief kind of, and I know you've got the data somewhere, from that 2021 to present, how many waivers were requested, how many were approved of those that were approved, and how many were denied?
Yeah, just give me a couple minutes. I got to find it, but yeah, I do have it.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
So I think there's kind of varying opinions on a couple, just a small logistical things here, but I think everybody's kind of on the same wavelength here. It's just maybe varying opinions on how we should do it. So you've all been sent what the policy is now. Full, and really the major change was that they added the term full-time. It didn't really even address part-time in the March 2021 policy change. There's no mention of part-time, so I guess that's left up to, we're assuming what it is, but I guess I'd like to look at if there's an opinion as to should the policy as it is remain, and if not, should it be, or if it should it be just clarified or remain as is, or if it should be changed, what are some changes that we would recommend? So just kind of as we're looking at the committee, I guess I would take a vote. Let's see, I know Sheriff Schmidt had to pull out. So does anybody want to make a motion for it to remain as is? Would anybody like to make a motion to change the policy? Well, let me rephrase it. Would anybody like to make a motion that would remain the policy as is, only clarify the wording? Okay. Is there anybody who would like to make a motion as far as that it should be changed, and that not propose what the changes are, but that it should be changed to something else?
I would make that motion. Joe
I'll
Beerke.
second. Yep, I'll second that motion, Ron.
Okay, so we have a motion by Chief, again, I'll be Verkant, is that correct? Okay, and then seconded by Chief Bishop. Is there any discussion on that? Okay, all in favor indicate with an eye.
Aye.
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 Any opposed? Okay, so now we've established that we think it should be changed. We've already had a little bit of discussion on what some people's thoughts are. In relation to what the policy currently is, does anybody want to offer any suggestions on what specifically should be changed and what it should say?
Ron, if I
And
can,
again-
quick.
Okay, Chief Bishop,
I don't,
what are your thoughts?
yeah, I don't have any like specific numbers, but I feel like what we're wrestling with is how many hours does somebody need to work to not have to go back through the 720-hour academy, and then how much time delay is there as well? And I don't know what that is offhand, but I think we need to define part-time. If you get out of the academy, you have 3 years to gain employment. If you gain part-time employment, how many hours does that officer, should they work over that 3 years to not have to redo the academy? And then after that 3-year period, how many hours do they have to work before they have to go back through it? So the current policy was just too harsh. It was kind of cut off. And it sounds like there's a lot of waivers that get approved, which is good. So then whatever those guidelines are probably what we should look at putting into this policy a little bit as we formulate it. I don't have any good answers at the moment. Just those are my thoughts that I'm working through.
I have a question too, Ron, before you continue, because I do employ part-timers. But I know some of them are limited by their retirement from other agencies. And so something just to consider as we move forward for part-timers there. I know it's a rolling 12 months, but I believe we're limited to 1,200 hours a year for a part-timer.
Right, so, and that was another thing I wanted to bring up. Now, I know that I think there is some pending legislation regarding the requirements that were enacted as part of Act 10, as far as changing that. So, but that's a good point, Chief Jones, is whatever that number we come up with, I think has to be kind of looked under the lens of what, say, for instance, an officer that retired in good standing under Act 10 is limited in the number of hours they can work, just based on what they can work in retirement. So with another WRS employer. So keep that in consideration. So if I can synopsis a little bit, what Chief Bishop had said is perhaps returning to the policy as it was in March prior to 2021, only establishing minimum some type of minimum hour threshold over a period of time for part-time officer employment.
Yes, yep.
Okay.
I'd be very agreeable with the chief's recommendation and with Jerry's recommendation of going back to the previous policy, with the exception of, I guess I want to be careful that it, I guess from my perspective, I guess I don't want that to be too high a number, I guess, and I'm basing that just on our experience with some of these limited people that work for us as bailiffs and ATV patrols and things like that, where they have a limited availability and those kind of things. However, I don't oppose the idea of trying to set a limit of time where it would eliminate some of those people who, as Sheriff Smith talked about, never work, that are just trying to maintain their certification, but yet are never putting any time in. Because we've had that problem as well, where, you know, and we've had to finally cut them loose because they want to maintain their certification, but yet they're not ever willing to work. So.
Question for you, Sheriff. What are your minimums that you look for? What is your policy then?
As far as what number of hours worked?
Yeah, your number of hours worked. What are your minimums that you would suggest then before you would say they're not working enough? Because I do have a policy and I do require like 40 hours a month. I figure at least then they're consistent with learning their sign-ins or, you know, not having things reset.
Right.
Well, what does that look like for you? You've got a lot of different jobs, and looking at Jerry's email from earlier, you know, he's got some examples of people who work less. I mean, are there people that just work state fair police for 10 days a year and that's all they work? Yeah.
Yeah. And like I said, we have a gentleman who right now is a retired teacher, but he's been on our roster for 30 some years and has always worked part-time for this agency. And for the most part, for several years, it was primarily working at our county fair and working ATV patrol and occasionally when needed, and then, but never an actual patrol position. So, but always had to maintain the minimum requirements of the 24 hours and the firearms, and it always has. And then we have others who have just literally been primarily bailiffs and an occasional transport and things like that. So that's why I say I'm not opposed to a minimum, but I guess from my perspective, it would want to be a fairly low number. I don't really, I guess, right off the top of my head, I don't know what that number would be. I would like to see it maybe X many hours a year as opposed to, say, a month, because it depends on those people as to when they work.
And so one other question, maybe for clarification with Jerry, he's got the list here, but where do the LTEs fall in? Is that, because I see the boat patrols listed on here, would that be an LTE position then if we're limiting what they can do or the number of hours we need them?
Well, that's a good question. I think there's a distinction, and to the sheriff's question, if the officer maintains continuous employment. In other words, this doesn't become an issue until there's a break in employment, right? They resign and then they want to go to another agency. And it's been more than 3 years since they last were employed full-time or since they graduated from the academy. I don't know if what Chief Bishop is proposing would establish a minimum number of hours to maintain certification, even for those officers, even like for the state fair police officers, for example. As long as they're maintaining their continuous employment, I think it would become more of an issue once there's a break in employment. That would be my understanding. I don't know that I would be in favor, because that would have certainly some unintended consequences as well. If we were to go to the Law Enforcement Standards Board and make a proposal that, any officer that, even those that maintain continuous employment, that fails to work 1,000 hours in a year or 800 hours in a year is subject to losing their certification. I don't think that's what your intent to your proposal was, unless I'm misunderstanding that. And so that should not, like for the example of you, the sheriff that you cited about this gentleman who's a school teacher that's been working there for 30 years, as long as he's maintaining his training hours and his certification, it shouldn't have any impact. The proposal to change the policy and establishing it, I don't think it would have any impact on individuals like that. But Chief Jones, to your question, I think that's a valid question, and that's something that's why I put that in my the document there, is that we really don't have any distinctions, like what's a reserve officer, what's a part-time officer, in terms of how many hours a year and different classifications, like we see in some of the other states where they have different definitions based on the number of hours that those officers are working.
So if I could, just to kind of lay, I guess, a little bit of perspective, is everyone, on the call is at an individual law enforcement agency, and looks at it, maybe looking at it under that lens. And I guess my request would be for the members of the committee to really kind of take that hat off and look at this under the lens of say, how it would be looked at through the LESB, which has oversight of all the law enforcement agencies across the state, regardless of what that law enforcement agency looks like. Certainly law enforcement and how it is done and what it looks like, say, in the city of Milwaukee, is certainly going to be different from how it's going to be looked at in, say, Iowa County. And so we have to look at it like as if these officers, once they separate employment from an agency and there is a gap and they want to go, they have to have that level of training so that we could approve their certification to go work in another agency like Milwaukee, or, so that, if they had 8 hours of experience every year for 5 years, and then they separate employment and now want to go to a full-time agency or work at another part-time agency, regardless of what that agency looks like, whether it's a sheriff's office or a police department, boat patrol, whatever, that we can, or the LESB can look at that gap, their previous training and experience, and feel comfortable with saying, yes, we're going to recertify this person for the next year. So I don't know if that makes sense, but when you're looking at this, look at this kind of as a statewide kind of a thing where we're certifying law enforcement officers to perform law enforcement duties, whether it's that teacher that works a couple hours a month helping out his community or helping out a sheriff's office or police department, or if it's that officer that's going to be working 40 hours a month at a police department, taking calls for service. The certification level for this across the state, the standards have to be the same. So looking at it under that kind of lens and trying to determine what is objectively reasonable for what we would require for hours or training to maintain that certification.
Hey, Ron. It's Joe. I won't make you say my last name. I guess that, training and standards has always been, and do me a favor to just take no offense to this, but I mean, you're the standard. You're the lowest standard usually. I mean, if we even look at a DOJ qualification for firearms, anyone should be able to pass this. Again, taking off that hat, I still just want to go back to the concept of providing that standard. And then again, allowing our departments and agencies, whether you're state patrol or you're a smaller sheriff's department, or a municipality or a city like mine, where I only have 7 full-time employees. Again, I think that's where we should really look at providing that standard. And again, that's why I said I think I like the recommendation of the March of 21, rather than the post.
Hi, everybody. So I initially, when thinking about this, was thinking we needed to maybe go towards defining part-time, but the more I sort of think on this subject here, for like our agency, limited term employment is defined similarly to some of those other agencies as 1,039 hours or less in any given 12-month period. But when we're talking about, who am I going to hire? If I, if somebody comes to us and applies and says, I haven't been working in LE for 3 years, but before that I worked, 40 hours in a given year for 5 years, and that's all I worked, I wouldn't feel comfortable just recertifying them and not making them go back through an academy. That seems like too little of time or experience on. And if we change the wording to say nothing, or to just say, at least part-time, I think that provides still the ability to have any number of hours. Basically, as long as you were employed for 1 year before separating, any amount of work means that LESB is going to recertify you. And to me, for some of the reasons why they changed it initially, that I think there's circumstances where there's too little work being done. If you as an agency want to maintain somebody who works minimally, I think that's fine. But I don't think that after separating for potentially up to 3 years that they're now good to go without going through an academy again. So when I'm looking at this, I think we probably need to clarify the language, to not just go back to what it said prior, but to put some sort of hour mark in there, and that law enforcement, you had to have had employment and worked X amount of hours in that last year prior to termination or prior to leaving that agency. I don't know what that year threshold is, but somebody that works minimally, I think, should probably have to go back through the academy again.
Thank you. So one thing that I know that Jerry had discussed with internally here in the past, was when someone is outside of say, a situation where he or the Training and Standards Bureau staff would recommend an extension or a waiver of those timeframes. If they were outside of that, is there an appetite, or instead of having them complete the entire law enforcement academy, having them attend a structured update training that's not full 720, but something less than that? That includes, maybe firearms training, some vehicle pursuit, defensive and arrest tactics, con law updates, things like that, where they would be focused on areas of the curriculum we feel is most critical for an update, as opposed to going through the entire academy. So that instead of saying, well, your certification is done, it's gone, you have to go through the entire academy. Maybe you can regain that certification by attending some level of training to make up for that gap of employment. Do you have anything on that, Jerry, to add as far as what your thoughts were previously on, say, that update training?
No, I think I like that idea. I just think, there are states that have that. Like I believe South Dakota has like a transition academy for their hands-on skills. But they have basically one academy for the whole state. They have the infrastructure to do that. I think this has come up before prior to my time at Training and Standards, and I believe there was something like this at State Patrol, but it wasn't a mandatory requirement, and I don't believe there was a lot of enrollment in that. We'd have to get probably buy-in from some of the technical colleges to run this, whether it's a 40 or 80-hour course, and then determine what exactly goes into that curriculum, and then how is it funded? Maybe the officers are required to or their agencies to pay those fees or the tuition to attend that. But right now what we have is essentially like an all or nothing situation for somebody who has a waiver that's denied, that they either have to decide, okay, I guess I'm going to have to go back through the entire 720-hour academy, or I'm not going to be able to work in law enforcement anymore. Now there have been a few part-time academies, but we've only had, I think, Gateway Technical College, Northeast Wisconsin Technical College, and Northwood that's decided to take that grant money, and of course the grant money is gone now. That might be an option for somebody in this situation. But yeah, I think that having a transition academy for those hands-on skills would go a long way to kind of solving this problem. And then it gives those individuals the option to get primarily the hands-on training skills that that are somewhat perishable, especially when they've been out of the job for more than 3 years. But some of that's really, I think, that's more than just making a recommendation to change policy. Like I said, there's a lot of logistical requirements that would have to be approved to make that happen. It might be beyond the scope of this committee.
Well, and full disclosure, I'm interested in the idea. I think there's merit to it. The problem is the logistics of Training and Standards. Developing that curriculum is problematic, given our current staffing and what our staff are currently doing with the time that they have, and to develop a, lack of a better term, mini academy would be a difficult. And then I don't know looking at the numbers, and I know Dana just sent an email out with those numbers that I was talking about, as far as how many waivers we had requested and how many were recommended to be approved and which ones were denied. I don't know if there's a big enough market for that. And furthermore, because honestly, a technical college that's going to run something like that, they're going to need to have some people to attend it, and they're not going to run one of those courses with only very few officers. And you may have officers that are going to be employed in northern Wisconsin, and the only mini academy or update training is in Madison. So having getting that small number of people that it would apply to, I think, is I don't know if it's worth the time to put that together, and I don't know if there's many law enforcement academies that would run those courses. But I'm certainly not going to speak for the tech colleges or the employer-based academies. But is there any thoughts on any of that?
Ron, I can tell you from the State Patrol, we ran that contingency program We did it for several years. It was a 3-week training program where you, at lightning speed, you went through firearms, DAT, EVOC, every one of the tactical areas, con law and traffic law. The issues that we had is exactly what you were stating is, we ran one a year. We did not get a lot of people that would enter into it. There were times where we had like 2 students in a 3-week class. And the instructors felt that we were flying through it. Hence the reason we then moved into discussions on the reciprocity exam and why that was created for out of state. So the contingency was for exactly what you were talking about, but the reciprocity was developed due to the low enrollment and low numbers. So that's kind of a little history on what we had when we did that class.
Thank you. I know it was something that had been brought up, proposed, and talked about. So I wanted to make sure everyone was aware of that, I guess, potential option and the logistical issues that would come with it. Because like Jerry said, right now it's an all or nothing kind of a thing. So either you maintain your certification, or once it lapses and it's not, you don't get a waiver for an extension of time frame to regain, then it's a 720 all over again. So I guess we're back to then looking at potentially recommending returning to the policy that was in place prior to March 2nd, 2021. And then brainstorming some thoughts on part-time employment or timeframes to regain employment, or what those parameters for approval or denial of the request for recertification is. Do you want to discuss maybe a minimum number of hours annually as a threshold? I know Chief Jones had said that by policy, her agency requires 40 hours a month. That's, I don't know. And then I know, Chief Gill had proposed maybe not per month, but per year. Given someone that maybe work a seasonal, like say, someone who's working like a recreational patrol. Jim, I see you put something in the chat if you want to share it with the group.
Sure. And again, as it says there, just kind of thinking out loud, what about, possibly establishing a uniform field training period for officers to complete during the same 6-month period during which they're supposed to recoup or recover the training that they missed during their separation. I mean, that would potentially allow agencies to tailor it to what they think is most applicable to service in their communities. I don't know if that's, again, thinking out loud, I usually don't hazard to do so, but I thought I would just, we're in the brainstorming period, so I thought I'd throw it out there.
Okay, so if I understand what you're talking about is if someone is outside of the parameters and they're requesting certification, that instead of requiring them to go through the entire 720 Academy again, putting the onus on the employing agency to provide training during a field training period that would minimally satisfy the LESB to then grant recertification.
Yes,
So would that fall under, say, for instance, a contingent certification? Everyone's law enforcement certification is contingent, but a contingent certification grace period where a certain period of time where they would have to attend a certain amount of training dictated by the employing agency.
yes, I think that's the idea. Yeah. Again, I don't, I'm not holding it out as necessarily a good one, but
No, I'm interested in that. The only thing is we'll have to then discuss, well, what does, as a standard, what would that training be? And instead of sending them somewhere to a law enforcement academy, that the agency could provide that training in-house, if they possess the instructors to do so. I'm guessing, for instance, Sheriff Gill, do you have LESB certified instructors on staff?
Yes, we do. Not for every one of the categories, but yes, we do have some of those. I guess my only thought on that would be, I guess it depends on, or at least in my head, it would depend on what that person you're bringing back on, what would be their role. So in other words, if I'm bringing back a former law enforcement agent or law enforcement officer, and all I'm expecting that person to be is a bailiff, do I necessarily need them to go through the same field training that if I was going to bring somebody back to be a patrol or deputy? You know what I'm saying?
Yes, I do. And this is kind of back, I'll circle back to what I had said before, is in the eyes of the LESB and the Training Standards Bureau, certification is certification, whether, whatever your role is. So, I don't think we're going to have the ability to parse out training based on what the role is, because certification is certain. And then once they're certified, then they can take that to any other agency.
Sure.
Perhaps the only thing, Jim, that I'm thinking about is, there may be, for instance, smaller agencies that only employ part-time officers probably don't have staff, training staff, in all those areas where they could do that in-house. And then I don't know if they could partner with a larger agency to do that, but because really, I think we're looking at a lot of smaller part-time agencies only that are having this issue.
no, I think that's a valid point. I was just trying to come up with some way to provide flexibility, a little more flexibility, and allow the agencies that would consider these individuals that have gone through this lengthy separation period to undergo the type of training that department believes is most critical to service in that particular community. But but your point is absolutely a valid one with regard to the inability or the difficulty that smaller agencies would have to potentially provide that field training.
Hey, Jerry or Ron, it's Joe again. Could I get some clarification, please?
Sure.
And I can give you a specific subject. I have a part-time officer, and she works full-time in dispatch here in Barron County. And she resigned part-time patrol for me. And I guess the thing I thought we were kind of talking about here is with a part-time employment, her working very minimal hours, and again, also part of that is that she had a child, so I would say somewhere around 24 hours a month. But she resigned, so she's not going to be trained again. by my department. And as of June 30, she's not going to make the standards. Then after June 30, she would have to re-attend another academy, correct? I mean, that's what we're all talking here, right? It's not three, we're not talking about, that's kind of my issue is why I wanted to bring this up of the full-time verbiage versus part-time verbiage in here. Because again, is it 6 months? Is it 1 year of non-employed for part-time? As long as they don't make the training and standards hours that they have to go to the academy again.
Go ahead, Jerry.
So you mentioned June 30th. I'm assuming this officer is then part-time her whole career as a law enforcement officer, or did she work full-time at some point?
No, completely part-time, full-time dispatch.
Yeah, so the date reverts back to the date she completed the academy. That's when the 3-year time frame starts to tick, basically. So I'm assuming it's been more, than 3 years since she went through the academy. And now, so she has a break in employment. So she'd either have to apply for a waiver if she decides she wants to come back and work. Or absent that would have to go back and recomplete the academy.
And that's specifically why I wanted to be on this, just because I recently had this incident where we have a full-time dispatcher again, and I think, Sheriff, this is kind of the very few hours, a couple days a month coming in, and again, that's where I'm concerned that you're right, it goes back to the academy date, and now she's done now. So if she decides, you know what, I want to be a police officer or a deputy sheriff instead of being a dispatcher, she's got to go back to the academy. That's where I find this difficult.
Well, I can give you an example. I mean, this may not quite match up with your situation, but unfortunately, last year was not a good year for Wisconsin in terms of law enforcement officers killed in the line of duty. And one of those officers was in that same situation, was Emily Breidenbach. She had gone through the academy at Blackhawk, I think like in 2014 or 2015. And then she was sponsored by Stoughton PD. In fact, I think Ron was one of her instructors. And she worked full-time for Stoughton PD, but resigned in good standing short of a year. I think she had 9 or 10 months on the job. And, she was within the 3-year window of her last date of employment with Stoughton PD when she was hired by Shatek. However, that policy had changed in the interim, and it turns out she was outside the 3-year window from the date she completed the academy at Blackhawk. So, and this all occurred before we made this most recent policy change that the board approved in 2021. So she applied for a waiver. I made my recommendation to the board was to deny the waiver, and that she returned to the academy. And to her credit, she took it like a champ. She didn't complain. She was enrolled to go to the academy, I think at Indian Head, and in 2020, and then the academy ended up getting canceled through no fault of her own because of COVID. Well, she came back with a second waiver application, and I was really blown away. I mean, she had letters of endorsement from the district attorney in Barron County, from the mayor of Shatek, of course, the chief of police, members of the city council, and then she's included a packet with all of her activity, responding to calls for service, self-initiated activity since she'd been working patrol at Shatek, and then all the training that she had done. And when I took that back to the board, I changed my recommendation. I said, you know what, I don't think Emily needs to go back through the academy again. And the board approved it. And so that's kind of that's a rare example, but I only point that out to say that, these things are not always written in stone and we, at least speaking for myself, I try to take a look at all of the mitigating circumstances and make an informed recommendation and try to make sure the board knows all the details before they make a decision, and then I'm prepared to answer those questions. So that I only bring that up is to say that, yeah, in the case that you're describing, of course, she is working as a dispatcher, which I think is not the same as police work, but it is related to the profession. So that potentially would be a factor in her favor if she were to submit a waiver. And it also would depend on how long of a gap, between the time she resigned in good standing from your agency and maybe when she decides to come back. So, you're asking a kind of a hypothetical scenario. It's hard for me to say, yeah, she would definitely have to go back through the academy. Maybe not. I mean, she might get it's possible that a recommendation.
If that hypothetical scenario, Jerry, was within 3 years,
Oh,
what would your recommendation be?
you mean within 3 years of when she completed the academy?
Yeah, I guess you are going to the academy again. I apologize. I keep bidding,
Yeah.
mistaking the academy versus her resigning.
Yeah, I mean, certainly that yes, she's technically, she is outside that time frame. But the gap in terms of her employment from when she last worked until when she regains employment, that's certainly a relevant issue as well. So for example, a guy that's retired and maybe he's got 25 years on the job and then wants to look at the examples, the situation I mentioned earlier, if they're coming back after 5 years, well, then that's a different situation than if it's, 3 years and 3 months, for example. 5 year, there's no necessarily magic cutoff point, but it has to be, I guess, what would be considered reasonable. And, that's a pretty large gap to say, unless, like I said, unless in that 5-year period, they've been working in some sort of armed security capacity, or there's some other mitigating circumstance that might work in their favor. So it's not it's not completely open-ended. There's obviously got all those factors come into play when these waivers are submitted for review.
Okay, kind
Can
of
I ask a
sounds like,
question quick?
yes, go ahead.
That Jerry, what you shared confused me a little bit. So let's say this board or committee decides to recommend a change to an hour requirement, so you need to have 400 hours of law enforcement experience before you resign, and then you have 3 years to regain employment, and if not, you need to go back through the academy. So if somebody who did, like from Chief Jones's police department, were to have that, they had the 400 plus hours, they resign, take a year off, decide I want to go work for somebody else, that would be a non-issue. They could just, their credentials are still good within that 3 years, right?
Not necessarily, because if they resign from part-time employment, the way the policy is now, right?
I'm saying if we updated it.
Oh. Yes, probably it depends on the exact language in the new policy, but yes, if I understand your question correctly, I think that that person would be eligible to go back to work without having to go through the academy. Yes.
Okay.
So one of the questions that I have regarding Jerry's email that he sent out this morning is one of the unintended, I guess, consequences of the change in 2021 created more applications for waivers because of that. And when I had my discussion earlier with Sheriff Delane, he brought that to my attention. Is there are a number that they address when they address them. And I guess I was reassured by the fact that, you know, they do look at everyone individually and that every circumstance is looked at. So he gave me a few different examples. So there was no, I guess I wouldn't say, there's not a hard, fast line of you are outside that window, so therefore you're done. So that reassured me that the policy, even the new policy as of 2021, it wasn't really, I don't think, causing, maybe I'm misspeaking, but as many terminations as what it was originally made to, I guess, play out. Is that correct, Jerry?
Yes, you're absolutely right. The number of officers, I think that that you have essentially been told, like, hey, you have to go back to the academy is fairly minimal. I think probably the percentage of approvals on these applications is probably around 70% or so, if not higher. I think Dana may have those numbers, but you're right. It hasn't really impacted a large group of officers in the state of Wisconsin.
So yeah, I just sent that out and there were 27 waiver requests that are this type of a waiver request, and we recommended in favor of 17 of those. So 10 were denied.
Just so I have the accurate number, what was the maximum number of hours a retiree can work that's collecting?
What I've been told, it's 1,200 hours, but it's a rolling calendar year. So as the months drop off, they can add additional hours. But I'm struggling right now with some staffing with light duty. And so I've plugged in 2 part-timers and they're working full-time hours. So at that rate, I'll exhaust their hours by March.
Because I'm kind of brainstorming some language here. If anybody else has any other thoughts, feel free.
I'll jump in quick, Ron. I guess I'm kind of struggling with this as well, because on one hand, creating some hours for part-time employment to not have to go to the academy. I mean, I'm willing to obviously look into that. But I think what Chief Joe was talking about is, you know, I'm not going to hire somebody that's not ready to do the job. And then we're going to put them through a field training program. And we're going to figure out there if they're not able to do the job. And it's my community to figure out if they can do this job or not for our citizens. So, I mean, the old language seemed to, if the old language, how do I want to say this, but it didn't really affect that many people anyways, maybe just going to the back to the way it was initially written without any hour requirement is sufficient. So I'm just wrestling with that, I guess, a little bit.
I would agree with that. If you're looking for a motion, I'd be willing to make a motion to simply go back to the previous policy.
Yeah, and one of the bullet points in that document I sent out sort of addresses the original, one of the original reasons for this proposal was to ensure consistency with a reciprocity policy. However, that may be a bit of an apples to oranges analogy. So in other words, there's nothing unreasonable about having a particular requirement for eligibility for reciprocity that may be a little more stringent than what we have within our own within the officers within the state of Wisconsin, because it's reciprocity is by definition a waiver of the requirement to go through the academy, and very few of those applications are denied. I mean, the individual coming from another state may have gone through an academy that was only 400 hours, even though ours is 720. A lot of it depends on when they went through that particular academy, but we don't really get into the weeds and try to make a comparison to what it's basically kind of checking a box. Hey, did this person successfully complete preparatory training in whatever state, or if they're coming from the feds or the military? Yes, they did. Are they in good standing with their post? Yes. And have they had full-time employment within the last 3-year period? And so it's fairly minimal requirements. But my point being is that I don't think it's necessarily unreasonable to perhaps have a slightly different standard for officers that completed the academy within Wisconsin than what we have for our eligibility requirements for reciprocity.
So kind of what I've been kind of rolling around here, and I'll just kind of throw this out, is it sounds like there may be an appetite to return to the policy pre-March 2nd, 2021. Would there be value in adding information in that policy that basically states something to the effect of officers who separated from employment status or part-time employment status, and then establishing that part-time status means anything 1,200 hours annually or less, would have the ability to go back the 3 years, provided they had an average of 400 hours annual experience. And the way I came to 400 was looking at, like Chief Jones said, she requires 40 a month. That comes up to 48 or 480. I just went to a light most favorable, went down to 400. So if they were part-time officer status, which means under 1,200 hours annually, that if they had 400 or more average hours during their employment, then it would go back 3 years. If they had less than, then they would have to file a request for waiver. And then we'd have to figure out what type of criteria the LESB would consider. Did any of that make sense?
That makes sense for me because those hours work for me, but is there any other agencies that use part-timers less that wouldn't work for? Like the sheriff, if he's got a.
Yeah, that wouldn't cut it for me. I would have, so you're basically saying they would have to work between 400 and 1,200 hours annually in order to maintain that, correct?
Well, in order to be, for them to be able to enjoy the benefit of that 3-year window from the separation.
Right.
So that's just if they would separate employment and then look
Yes.
to be rehired at another agency.
Right.
Yes.
Yeah.
Because that's really what we're talking about, is time frame to regain employment and to maintain their certification. So if you had a part-time officer, it would be the same as the old policy. They have 3 years, but if they're but if they have part-time employment within that 3 years, if they had prior to separating less than 400 hours average during that part-time employment, then they would have to file or apply for a waiver. But if they had an average of more than 400 hours, we would say, yes, you can, we will grant you the benefit of recertifying within that 3-year window. But if you're outside of the less than 400 hours a year, now we'll have to go through a waiver process. And then we'll look at those on a case-by-case basis.
On Dana's email that she sent out, I mean, I see this for the waivers or what was allowed, but do you look at those hours? Is that a consideration when you've made these in the past for waivers? Or is this would be something completely new?
It's not a normal practice. There have been occasions where I've asked for that. But we certainly can do that, I think, and put the burden on the officer to provide the documentation, of the hours that they worked. So it
Because
hasn't been
your example before with Emily, I think was an excellent example. They took that burden on and they proved it to you. So
Yeah.
is that what we're asking for, is like these officers to say, yep, I made this minimum and here's why and here's how, and short of printing out maybe your training.
Exactly. Yeah. I didn't even request it. I mean, she did that all on her own and submitted the packet. And I was very impressed. So, and I think Ron's idea, it provides flexibility for those officers that kind of like what we have now, but I think it will reduce the number of waivers that we received currently. But like I said, we can still look at those individual situations and make appropriate recommendations to the board. So we're not just saying, hey, if you're under 400 hours, you automatically have to go back through the academy. No, but you will have to apply for a waiver. So we can at least take a look at your situation and make an informed recommendation to the Law Enforcement Standards Board.
Yeah, I'm not married to the 400. I just threw that out there based, just kind of looking at what Chief Jones had. And then I just made it a round number, dropped it down to 400. We could go down to 3. I mean,
Do you
whatever.
think 20 hours a month is enough where you'd have 240 a year, or is that not enough?
Well, see, then you start getting into, well, what were you doing? What agency, what was the activity level of the agency you worked for?
I think
Then
the
you're in my
400.
boat again. Then you're in my boat again, where they're working full-time in dispatch, but only 2 days a month for me, which I make them work 2 days a month. I don't care if we're double booked or whatnot. They have to work 2 days a month to stay on part-time with me. But even Chief Jones, with your predicament, you have these full-time retired officers who now came back to work part-time. So if they decide they want to go on a cruise ship, like one of my friends did for the next 2 years or 3 years, 3 years, and then come back and again, and I will tell you right now, there's a couple of deputy sheriffs who asked if they could come back after Hunter and Emily's death. And but again, they're outside of the 3-year window.
But they'd be
So,
different because they
yeah.
were full-time before.
Correct, but they're
Yeah.
outside of the 3-year window, so they'd have to go back to the academy and
Or
I
go
think
after the waiver.
exactly. I'll be honest, I didn't really know about the waiver. I knew Emily was going through that at the time, but with your predicament in itself, I mean, right now they're part-time employees. They would need this hourly set, in all reality, to get that 3 years of ability to come back. If they were to, resign or go somewhere else for a bit.
Jerry, how long does a waiver process take? Because when we need to hire somebody, we usually need to hire them pretty quickly.
Yeah, it just depends on the next meeting of the Law Enforcement Standards Board. So, and we can present them to the executive committee as well. So that basically 8 meetings per year. The board meets March, June, September, December, and then the executive committee always meets the month prior, February, May, August, November. So yeah, like, for example, we have a meeting, executive committee meeting on February 13th. And I've probably got 3 or 4 waivers on the agenda for that particular meeting. So it just depends on, the timing of when the next meeting is going to be. But keep in mind, I mean, these individuals can, under Wisconsin statute, work and be in field training for up to a year before, completing the camp. So, and don't necessarily want to make that investment if it's someone if you're not prepared to send them to the academy, if it's likely that their waiver is going to be denied. But I have no problem sharing my recommendation with the agency, but with a caveat, hey, it's simply a recommendation, does not necessarily mean that the board is going to agree with that.
I guess overall, I feel like we should just go back to the way the policy was, because we're talking about the number of hours and, which on one hand I like, but 400 probably is too high. And if it's going to be anything lower than that, then I think we're kind of splitting hairs, and we just let the administrators of these agencies determine if they're the right fit for them and their community. And if it's outside of 3 years, then they have to go back to the academy or get a waiver like it was prior.
For me, just thinking about it from LESB's perspective, I mean, they're sort of the gatekeepers for recertification standards. And so I don't know, if that's me, I just get nervous about somebody that worked very minimally, then has a break in service for 3 years or less than that, maybe 2 years, and they're automatically they can just go grab employment again with somebody else. Their certification's still good. I don't know, that seems like we could find ourselves in some very high liability situations. So that if I'm LESB, that would make me nervous to do that. And I would want to minimally look at kind of what they've done. And if based on their background, that seems reasonable, then I'm okay with that approval going. But yeah.
And I'm certainly not going to speak for the LESB. I just get a sense of from attending the executive and the full board meetings. I mean, this committee can recommend whatever it is that they recommend. I just don't know if just a blanket recommendation of returning to the old policy would be approved by the LESB. So I guess what I'm saying is maybe considering some type of give and take that would give them kind of an added level of assurance or comfort level, like the major was talking about there in the recommendation. That's my thought. I'd hate to see the committee make just a blanket recommendation that the LESB will ultimately dismiss. I mean, if that's what you want to do, then that's what we do. But I think it's certainly beneficial to consider other options as well. That, like I said, on the forefront, what the committee decides is what it decides, and I'll put forth whatever that is. But that's just an area of consideration. Jerry, do you have any thought on that, and what your thought is?
I tend to agree with you, Ron, that I think a good this is the establishing maybe a minimum hour requirement that's not, for 400 hours seems like a good number. It doesn't necessarily have to be that, but some sort of compromise as opposed to, just repealing it back to the pre-2021 policy. The board may balk at that, and but it's subject to the approval, I think, of this committee, and I mean that we're just the messengers in this case, I think, and to relay whatever this committee decides. And by the way, is this something that will be on the agenda for the March meeting? Is that the time frame we're looking at?
No, I didn't, when I proposed this to the LESB, I didn't give them a firm date of, we don't have to decide anything today.
Okay, that was
you
my
know,
question.
Today is basically kind of an opening discussion. And we're getting on to an hour and 40 minutes here. And we can certainly bring this committee back together, give you some time to chew on it and think about it. And maybe come up with some firm proposals that, I mean, it's necessary to have the discussion before we make any decisions. So, and that's what today was about. And I know there's at least through the committee, there's some interest in returning to the old policy. And that's fine. I know we had taken a vote earlier, essentially agreeing, the committee agrees that the policy as it is today shouldn't, we don't want to go forward as it is written today. And then maybe if I got the motion correctly, was to return to the previous policy with looking at clarifying some parameters.
Ron?
Yes.
One thing, and maybe this is getting in the weeds a little bit, but I think any proposal we should probably have a provision that this is not to be retroactive. So in other words, anyone who may have been impacted by this in the past doesn't get another kick at the can, because if we start establishing that precedent, for example, there's the other subcommittee that's looking at the PRT. If changes are made to that, I don't think we want to establish a precedent that, hey, if you failed the PRT in the past couple of years, you're good to go. You somehow have a mulligan to come back. So, because that was a question that was brought up during the Academy Directors meeting, and I think it's a valid point.
Okay. All right. I think what, for me, and speak up if you don't agree, but I guess what I'd like to do is put together meeting minutes, send it out to the group. We'll reschedule another meeting, let everybody kind of chew on it. I can put a couple of options, and as people had kind of proposed through the meeting, put a couple of options together, let the group review that, kind of chew on it, and come back at a future meeting date after you've got a chance to review and think about it. Not that it's going to change your mind with anything that anybody's said, but again, looking at it in the spirit of compromise, where like I said, I'm not going to, I can't, and I won't speak for any members of the LESB or the executive committee or what they're going to do, but just simply returning to the old policy as is, I don't know, would pass the committee, or the board. Like I said, I don't know, maybe it would, but I'd kind of like to look at it under a compromise kind of lens. And the other thing that and this is no offense to Jerry at all, but I'd like to look at some type of avenue where when there is some waiver that is submitted, Jerry has a more firm set of circumstances to judge a decision just simply based off of kind of his recommendation. So that he or if Jerry were to retire later this year, whoever would take his place would have some type of guideline to go by, or whoever would jump in if he's unavailable to make that staff recommendation, so that there's some kind of guidelines to guide the staff recommendation of approving or denying a waiver. Just to, so it's not based off of a feeling, or, so we have something more firm. That's just my thought. And I'll take if anybody has any other suggestions on that.
I have one other suggestion, Ron. We talked about minimum hours, but what if it was a combination, or could be a combination of minimum hours and training hours? Where people could do that on their own, because we all have access to ACADIS, and maybe they're even doing that type of training, or they're finding classes on their own that are entered, but as long as they can prove that they're continuing their training. Because I know part of the concern is the 24 hours a year, which they have to do minimally, but could they do more to make up for the actual employee hours?
Yeah. And like Dana had said earlier, is one, the onus then would obviously be on them, because if they're not employed by an agency and the agency doesn't import that training into ACADIS, we wouldn't know about it. So, and I know that there are agencies out there that import all training that their officers do, and there are agencies that import only the minimum number of training hours for their officers to recertify. So, they keep their own training records locally and only report enough to get through to satisfy certification.
That was part of the packet, by the way, that Emily Breidenbach submitted, was training certificates and such that may or may not have been in ACADIS, but it wasn't just a summary of her work activity, but it was also the trainings that she had done on her own. So that's a good point.
Okay. Well, like I said, I'll compile some meeting minutes, get it out to the group. I'd like to schedule another meeting. I don't want to make any recommendations today. I'd like everybody to kind of think about it. And like I said, think about it in kind of the lens of, the Law Enforcement Standards Board and the Training and Standards Bureau tracking and maintaining certification and making recommendations on that. And then doing something that's, reasonable under the circumstances. So today is January 25th. How long do you want to push out to well, let me ask you this. That I guess that would be my proposal, unless somebody has a different idea or wants to make a motion on something else. Like I said, I'm just facilitating the discussion.
I agree with you, Ron. I think that's the best course of action at this point. I do have to step away. I apologize. I'll just look for your email out with minutes and whatnot. And regardless of the date, I'll make that work. So whatever you guys can come up with. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Sheriff.
Ron, I did like that you sent out that calendar too, where we could input our days. That was helpful.
Okay. So you want me to come up with a couple potentials and then send out another poll?
If you don't mind, that worked well for me, and then we get the majority.
Okay. All right. All right. That sounds good. I'll probably be looking towards the end of February, probably. But I'll put together a couple of dates and shoot it out in that poll for a next meeting. Does anybody, I guess, looking, is there any, well, let me get logged back in here. I'm just looking at the agenda here. So we talked about everything, talked about next steps, what we'll do. Is there anybody, I guess for a roundtable, does anybody have anything for a roundtable, any parting comments or anything else they want to discuss regarding this committee or the mission? Okay, I'm not going to go full Robert's rules here and get a motion to adjourn. I think we can agree to adjourn. I'll send out a meeting survey for the next dates. Thank you all for coming and giving your input. I appreciate it. We'll be in touch. All
So.
Thank you.
Thank you.
right, yeah, bye.